the most powerful bomber ever built, the aircraft that ended World War II, the machine that dropped the atomic bomb, hailed as America's greatest engineering achievement. But behind the victory parades, behind the newspaper headlines, behind the official reports, there was a secret buried deep inside Boeing's own engineering files, a flaw so dangerous, so deadly, that men were burning alive at 30,000 feet. And Boeing knew. They knew before the first plane ever left the ground. They knew before the first crew ever climbed inside. They knew, and they said, absolutely nothing. Welcome to Warplane Mysteries, the channel where history doesn't just tell you what happened, it shows you why it was hidden. Now, before we go any further, if you are watching this right now and you have not yet subscribed to this channel, think of it this way. You wouldn't read only one page of the most important book of your life and then put it down forever, would you? No, of course not. So go ahead. Press that subscribe button right now. Take just 1 second, because the stories on this channel, they are not finished in one video. And we would hate for you to miss what comes next. Also, drop a comment below and tell us, where in the world are you watching this from today? Whether you are watching from New York, London, Karachi, Sydney, or somewhere we have never even heard of, we want to know. Write your city, your country, right down there in the comments. Now, in the spring of 1944, the United States Army Air Forces introduced the world to something it had never seen before. It was enormous. It was fast. It flew higher than any enemy fighter could reach. And it carried enough firepower to level an entire city in a single mission. They called it the B-29 Superfortress. To the American public, the B-29 was not simply an aircraft. It was a symbol. A proof that American industry, American engineering, and American determination had produced something the world could not match. Newspapers ran stories about it. Newsreels celebrated it. Military officials described it as the weapon that would end the war. And in many ways, they were right. The B-29 did end the war. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 named Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb ever used in combat over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second B-29 named Boxcar dropped another over Nagasaki. Within days, Japan surrendered. World War II was over. The B-29 had done what no other aircraft in history had done before. But behind that victory, behind that legend, there was a story that nobody in authority was rushing to tell. It's because while the generals were celebrating and while the newspapers were printing photographs of smiling crews standing beside their aircraft, something else was happening. Something quiet, something documented, something known. B-29s were catching fire in the air. Not occasionally, not as rare mechanical accidents. Regularly, systematically. In a pattern that any trained engineer could recognize immediately. The aircraft's right are 3350. Engines, the most powerful aircraft engines in the world at that time, were running dangerously, catastrophically hot. The engine cowlings, the design of the airflow around the engines, the placement of critical components near extreme heat sources, all of it created conditions that turned these engines into fire hazards at altitude. Crews reported it. Pilots documented it. Engineers noted it in internal records. And inside Boeing's own files, the files that the public would not see for decades, the data was already there. The flaw was known. The danger was documented. And the aircraft went into mass production anyway. This is not a story about a war. This is a story about a decision. A calculated institutional decision made by people in suits, sitting in offices, far from the burning sky. And the consequences of that decision would outlast the war itself. There is a particular kind of silence that is more dangerous than any spoken lie. It is the silence of a man who knows, who understands exactly what he knows, and who chooses, very deliberately, to say nothing. In the early 1940s, that silence had a redress. It was located in Seattle, Washington. inside the offices of the Boeing Aircraft Company, while American airmen were climbing into B-29s across the Pacific theater, trusting their lives to every rivet, every engine, every engineering decision made on their behalf. A very different conversation was happening behind closed doors. Boeing's own engineers had identified the problem long before mass production began. The Wright R3350 duplex cyclone engine, the massive 18-cylinder power plant that gave the B-29 its extraordinary range and altitude capability, was generating heat levels that the aircraft's engine cowling design simply could not manage. The physics were not complicated. Hot air needed to escape. The design was not allowing it to escape efficiently, and the components sitting closest to that trapped heat, fuel lines, magnesium crankcase parts, ignition systems, were sitting directly in the path of temperatures that should never have been permitted near them. This was not a theoretical concern buried in a footnote. This was documented, tested, recorded. Internal engineering reports flagged the overheating patterns during early test flights. Mechanics on the ground were noting abnormal heat signatures after routine engine runs. Test pilots were returning from evaluation flights and filing reports that described engine behavior no production aircraft should have been cleared to exhibit. The data existed. The warnings existed. And yet, when Boeing presented the B-29 to the United States Army Air Forces for approval, when contracts were signed, when production schedules were locked, none of that internal documentation shaped the public safety conversation in the way it should have. The question that serious analysts must ask here is not simply what went wrong. The question is, who decided that the contract mattered more than the cockpit? Because that decision did not happen by accident. Large institutions do not stumble into concealment. They construct it slowly, through layers of internal approval, careful language, and the quiet professional understanding that certain findings are inconvenient. Boeing in the 1940s was not a small company taking a careless risk. It was a sophisticated organization with sophisticated engineers who understood with complete clarity what those engine temperatures meant for the men flying those aircraft. The Army Air Forces were under enormous pressure. The war in the Pacific was grinding and brutal. Japan was not surrendering. The military needed the B-29 to be ready. It needed the B-29 to be reliable. It needed the B-29 to be now. And Boeing understood that pressure very well. In the language of modern business analysis, what happened next is called demand-driven risk suppression. When a client needs something urgently enough, when the contract is large enough, when the consequences of delay are severe enough, the institutional incentive shifts. It shifts away from full disclosure. It shifts toward delivery. The engineering record does not disappear in these situations. It simply stops traveling upward through the organization. The men who wrote the reports kept their jobs. The reports themselves were filed, and the B-29s rolled out of the factories in Wichita, in Renton, in Marietta, gleaming, powerful, and carrying inside their engines a flaw that their builders had already measured, already named, and already chosen not to elevate. For the young entrepreneur watching this today, but the business leader building something at speed under pressure, this moment in Boeing's history is not ancient. It is not irrelevant. It is a precise, documented illustration of what happens when an organization allows contract preservation to sit above engineering honesty. The B-29 was a masterpiece of American industrial capability. It was also a machine that killed the men inside it. And both of those things were true at exactly the same time. Numbers are honest in a way that institutions rarely are. They do not negotiate. They do not file reports with carefully chosen language. They do not sit in boardrooms and calculate what is convenient to disclose and what is strategically better left unspoken. Numbers simply record. And the numbers surrounding the B-29's operational history in World War II record something that no official celebration of that aircraft has ever been entirely comfortable addressing. Between 1943 and 1945, The United States lost more B-29 crew members to mechanical failure and engine fires than 2 Japanese anti-aircraft fire over certain operational periods in the Pacific Theater. Read that again? Slowly. More American airmen, men who had trained for years, men who had crossed an ocean to fight, were being killed by their own aircraft than by the enemy they had been sent to destroy. The Wright R-3350 engine fires were not isolated. Incidents that could be reasonably attributed to battlefield damage or pilot error. They followed a pattern. A consistent, traceable engineering pattern. Engines would overheat on long overwater missions. Magnesium components inside the engine casing would ignite. And at 30,000 feet, over open ocean, with no place to land and no way to fight a fire burning inside an engine nozzle, there was no surviving that. Entire crews simply did not return. Mission reports documented it. Squadron commanders reported it up the chain of command. The Army Air Force's own technical teams were dispatched to investigate. Modifications were attempted, baffles added, cowl flap adjustments made. Operational procedures revised to try to manage engine temperatures during critical flight phases. But modifications are not the same as solutions. And procedural workarounds are not the same as fixing what was wrong from the beginning. What makes this chapter of the B-29 story particularly significant, not merely as history, but as a precise lesson in institutional behavior, is what happened to Boeing during this period. Nothing, no contract, was canceled. No public accountability was demanded. No formal investigation was launched into what Boeing had known when they had known it, and what decisions had been made inside their engineering departments before the first production aircraft ever left the factory floor. The reason was not complicated. The United States was fighting the largest war in human history. Japan needed to be defeated. The B-29 was the instrument chosen to deliver that defeat. And in that environment, in that specific atmosphere of national urgency and military necessity, the institutional incentive to protect Boeing was, from the government's perspective, entirely rational. Boeing built the weapon that America needed. Investigating Boeing meant slowing down the weapon America needed. And so the silence that had begun inside Boeing's engineering offices extended outward. It was absorbed by the military procurement system. It was covered by the urgency of war. It was buried beneath the genuine heroism of the crews who flew those aircraft, who knew the risks, who climbed in any way, and who deserve every honor history has given them. But heroism is not a substitute for honest engineering. And the men who burned over the Pacific Ocean did not die because the problem was unsolvable. They died because solving it loudly was institutionally inconvenient. For the entrepreneur studying this case today, the lesson is precise and transferable. When an organization survives an ethical failure without consequence, it does not learn that it was wrong. It learns that the strategy worked. It learns that silence, managed carefully and timed correctly, is a viable institutional tool, and it carries that lesson forward. Boeing carried it forward for decades, and the world would eventually see exactly where that lesson led. History does not repeat itself by accident. It repeats itself because institutions allow it to, because the people inside those institutions, intelligent people, educated people, professionally accomplished people, learn over generations that a certain way of operating works. That silence, managed correctly, is survivable. That disclosure, handled carelessly, is not. And once an organization learns that lesson deeply enough, it stops being a lesson. It becomes a culture. Boeing carried that culture forward from the 1940s with remarkable consistency. Not because every individual inside the company was dishonest, not because every engineer who ever worked in Seattle was indifferent to human life, but because cultures do not require villains to sustain themselves. They require systems. They require incentive structures. They require the quiet, unspoken professional understanding that certain findings travel upward through the organization, and certain findings do not. By the time the 21st century arrived, Boeing was no longer the same company that had built the B-29. It was larger, it was publicly traded, it was operating inside a global commercial aviation market worth hundreds of billions of dollars annually. Its competitor, Airbus, was advancing aggressively. Its airline customers were demanding fuel efficiency. Its shareholders were demanding returns. The pressure environment had changed. The institutional response to pressure had not. In 2017, Boeing introduced the 737 MAX, a redesigned, updated version of its legendary 737 narrow-body aircraft. The MAX featured new, larger, more fuel-efficient engines. But those engines, due to their size, had to be repositioned on the aircraft's wing. And that repositioning changed the aircraft's flight handling characteristics in ways that created a dangerous tendency to pitch upward under certain conditions. Boeing's engineers knew this. To manage the handling problem without requiring expensive and time-consuming pilot retraining that airline customers did not want to pay for, Boeing developed a software system called MACAS, the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. It was designed to automatically push the aircraft's nose down when sensors detected an excessive pitch angle. It was, in concept, an engineering solution. In execution, it was something else entirely. The MCA's system relied on data from a single anglovatic sensor, a single point of failure. If that sensor malfunctioned and sensors malfunction, the system would activate incorrectly, repeatedly forcing the nose of the aircraft downward, overriding pilot inputs and driving the plane toward the ground. This was not an unknown risk. Boeing's own internal documentation would later reveal that engineers had identified MCAs as a potential hazard. The Federal Aviation Administration, which was supposed to provide independent regulatory oversight, had delegated significant portions of the 737 MAX safety certification process back to Boeing itself, a regulatory arrangement that the B-29 era would have recognized immediately. The oversight was institutional. The conflict of interest was institutional. The silence was institutional. On October 29, 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 departed Jakarta, Indonesia. 12 minutes after takeoff, it crashed into the Java Sea. 189 people were killed. On March 10, 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 departed Addis Ababa. 6 minutes after takeoff, it crashed into a field southeast of the city. 157 people were killed. In both cases, MCAs had activated based on a faulty sensor reading. In both cases, the crews fought the system until the ground took them. In both cases, the outcome had been by any serious engineering analysis foreseeable. 346 people. That is the number. That is what the silence cost this time. Not over the Pacific Ocean in wartime. Not in a theater of combat where death carries the terrible cover of necessity, but on commercial flights. On ordinary mornings. On aircraft carrying passengers who had purchased tickets, packed luggage, and trusted, as passengers always must trust, that the people who built the machine had told the truth about it. The institutional line from the B-29 to the 737 MAX is not a metaphor. It is a direct, documented, organizational inheritance. The same pressure calculus, the same suppression of inconvenient engineering data, the same strategic management of regulators, the same prioritization of delivery timelines over disclosure obligations. And for the entrepreneur, the business leader, the young professional building something today under competitive pressure, this is the lesson that Boeing's full history delivers with absolute clarity. The short-term cost of honest disclosure is always visible. The long-term cost of silence is always larger. Boeing survived the B-29. Boeing survived the silence. Boeing learned the wrong thing from both. And 346 people on 2 ordinary mornings paid the price for a lesson that should have been learned 8 decades earlier.